So in this problem, we are going to examine Jordan's score, and assuming that the test scores are normally distributed, we're going to use this normal distribution and our empirical rule to explore what Jordan's score was comparatively and some of the other students and the range that they scored in. So if we look at this information, it says that Jordan scored a 53 on his math test with the class average. So my average here, or my mean, is going to be 57 with a standard deviation of 2. So my standard deviation here is going to be 2. It says how many standard deviations below the mean, did Jordan score? So we're just going to fill out our distribution here, and we'll do this here in blue. So my average, we said, was 57. So that's this middle, right here down the middle. That is my mean. And then it says that there's a standard deviation of 2. That means if we go one standard deviation above the mean, we go up 2. So this would represent 59. And then if we went 2 standard deviations above the mean, we would be at 61. At 3 standard deviations above the mean would be 63. And then the same, if we go 1 standard deviation below the mean, then we subtract 2 from 57, and now we're at 55. If we go 2 standard deviations below the mean, we're now at 53. 3 standard deviations below the mean, we're at 51. So the first thing we can answer here is, well, Jordan got a 53 on his test. We see that that is represented by 2 standard deviations below the mean, right? We could either graph it that way or look up here and say 1 standard deviation is 2. Then if we wanted to figure out how many he was away, we'd take the average, we would subtract his score. That gives us 4. We compare that to the standard deviation, divide by 1 standard deviation, and it gives us 2 to tell us that he's 2 standard deviations away from the mean. Okay, and then let's answer some of these questions here using our empirical rule. So what percentage of the class scored between, so the first one, between 55 and 59? Well, our empirical rule tells us that 68% of the data falls in between 1 standard deviation. So 68 total here falls in between 1 standard deviation above and below the mean. So if we break that down, that tells us that 34% is represented 1 standard deviation above, and then 34% is 1 standard deviation below. And then we continue on with our empirical rule. So our empirical rule says that 95% of the data, 95% of the population is going to fall in between 2 standard deviations. So 95% of the data falls between 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. So if we look at that and we say, well, okay, well, what is this area right here? What is this represented by and this? Well, if we take 95, we know that this middle portion here, this middle portion is already 68. So if we say 95 and we subtract from that, if we say 95 and we subtract from that 68, we get 27. So if we break up 27 into 2 parts, because it's represented here and here, so the 2 areas combined is worth 20% of the data. If we divide that by 2, we get 13.5. So that means that this right here this portion is 13.5% of the data, as well as this. And you can continue to do this for the rest. The last part of my empirical rule says that between 3 standard deviations is 99.7% of the data falls between 3 standard deviations, meaning it's extremely rare that it's above or below 3 standard deviations. And that leaves us, if we do the math, then we subtract, right, 99.7. We subtract out that middle portion that we've already accounted for. Then we're left with 4.7. And when you divide that by 2 to give us 2 equal portions here, this portion and this portion, then you get 2.35. So this last little bit, 2.35 here and here. And that just leaves us with this last tiny little bit right here above the really rare above and below 3 standard deviations. Well, at this point, we're at 99.7%, so it's only made up of 0.3% of the data, which if you divide that by 2, you're getting 0.15 for each. So this would be 0.15 and 0.15. So now this is the graphic that you've seen with the empirical rule. Now we can answer this. So okay, how many of the students got a score between 55 and 59? Well, that is represented here between 55 and 59. That's from 1 standard deviation below to 1 standard deviation above, and we know that that is 68%. So 68% of the students. Well, what about 57 to 61? 57 to 61 now is from here to here, and that is going to represent this portion right here, from 57, the mean, to 61. So we look at what percentage that makes up, and it's 34% here and 13.5% here. So if we're interested in all the students in between those 2 points, we would just add up the 34 plus the 13.5 to give us, well, that is 47.5%. And then finally, above 61, starting to get a little messy here, but above 61, here's 61, it's above 2 standard deviations, is represented by this portion right here, the 2.35% and the 0.15. So if we add those together, we have only 2.5% of the class scored above 61.